Good evening. Good morning for friends who are joining us from the Indo-Pacific. My name is Jonathan Berkshire Miller, and I'm Director and Senior Fellow of the Indo-Pacific Program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this discussion today, which I think is very well timed on the Indo-Pacific. Specifically, our webinar tonight is titled, Why Canada Needs a Robust Indo-Pacific Strategy. And I think, again, the timing for this is very important. We've been seeing a lot of news, obviously, about the Indo-Pacific. Most recently, we've had the Shangri-La Dialogue, which was held in Singapore this past week. And we're going to have a panel of experts to suss out the different issues and how they impact Canada. As many of you know, MLI has been placing a good bit of attention to the importance of the Indo-Pacific and its nexus with Canada's own foreign policy interests. Over the past year, we've hosted events and given a platform to key thought leaders across the region, highlighting the key stakes in the region and outlining the imperative for Canada to bolster its own engagement. And tonight we have guest speakers joining us from all over the Indo-Pacific, including Tokyo, Sydney, Australia, Honolulu, Ottawa, and Victoria. So we are truly scoping the region tonight. The timing right now, Canada has been putting a lot of thought process into the Indo-Pacific, and I think a lot of our panelists are going to look into this through their remarks. For example, just a few data points. The Indo-Pacific Secretariat has now been stood up for about 3 years internally at the Global Affairs Canada. In addition to this, we have mandate letters from both ministers last December to deliver on a strategy for the Indo-Pacific, and we also have this outlined in letters to the throne. We even now have a new group of advisors who are tasked with providing information to help inform the strategy to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So there's a lot of momentum, obviously, building, and now is the time for the Canadian government to deliver on this momentum and implement what we hope is an effective and robust strategy. So before turning it over to the panelists today, I just wanted to start with a few different points that I think are important for us to think about. First of all, obviously, we cannot be thinking about the challenges in the Indo-Pacific and some of the different externalities that they pose without looking at the current crisis that's happening in Europe. While our hearts and our minds are obviously with our Ukrainian friends in Europe, I think fundamentally we have to realize that while the crisis is right now, this is an international security crisis. And we've seen this with the response of some of the states in the Indo-Pacific, such as Japan, South Korea, and even Singapore and ASEAN, placing sanctions on Russia for its egregious behavior in Ukraine. And I think that this is for two reasons. Fundamentally, this is about the rules-based order and the threats that this is posing. But also, I think there's an eye on some of the challenges and what may happen in the Indo-Pacific in the coming years if actions like this are to be are not to have certain punishments or punitive measures against them. Indeed, at the most recent Shangri-La Dialogue, as I just referenced, Kishida Fumio, who is Japan's prime minister, made an interesting speech, and I'll just quote one line from him. He noted, "Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow." So I think the eyes of our key partners and allies in this part of the world, of course, are focused on Europe, but are all focused on challenges in this part of the world and some of the different flashpoints, be it Taiwan, be it in the East China or South China Sea, or even be it in the Indian Ocean region. So 4 words that I'll leave, and maybe this will help stimulate some discussion amongst our panel on how Canada should be or could be thinking about the Indo-Pacific as it finalizes its strategy process. And these are 4 sort of words that come to mind for me, and I don't know that everyone agrees with it. But the first one I think that we need to be focused on is urgency. The fact is we're very late to this game. The United States, India, Australia, Japan, obviously the members of the Quad, have long been thinking about the Indo-Pacific. But it's not just the members of the Quad. We have ASEAN itself now with its own outlook to the Indo-Pacific. We have within Europe, the European Union has its own strategy for the Indo-Pacific, in addition to Germany and the Netherlands, which is not even the Pacific coastline, having its own Indo-Pacific strategy. So we need to have some urgency when we think about this part of the world. The second element is balance. We need to have a balanced strategy that looks, of course, at the trade interests and the investment interests alongside the security interests that we face in this part of the world. The third element, I think, is empathy. When we think about this region, we have to balance Canadian interests and what we want to pursue also with what the region is thinking and with what their concerns are. And finally, when we're thinking about the Indo-Pacific, at least from my perspective, we need to think about it in sustained ways. This is not going to be some task force where we look for 6 months or a year and check the box and say we're done. This is going to be a long-term effort, and it's something that we're going to have to put immense focus on in the long-term time frame. So with that being said, I'd like to move on to pass the floor to our panelists, really the ones who are going to explore these issues more. And maybe I'll start with introducing them all very briefly, and apologies for giving them such short shrift on their extensive CVs and bios, but we want to get to the heart of the discussion. So maybe I'm going to start with Jim Boutilier, who is our distinguished fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and also man extraordinaire on all things Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific for Canada. So Jim, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jim. The second panelist is Thomas Wilkins, who is joining us all the way from Sydney, Australia, and is a senior fellow with ASPI in Australia, in addition to being a colleague of mine as a senior fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs in Tokyo. Tom, thanks for joining us. Next, we have Akiko Fukushima, who is joining us from Tokyo tonight. And she is at the Tokyo Foundation for Policy Research and also an impressive scholar on all things Indo-Pacific as well as European security issues. Fukushima-sensei, thank you for joining us. And next we have John Hemmings. Enviously, he is joining us from Honolulu, hence the aloha wear. John is a professor at the Daniel Inouye Center, Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies, and has a host of other affiliations, is a security and defense expert, and again, all things extraordinary on the Indo-Pacific. John, thanks for joining us. And finally, last but not least, we have Dr. Meredith Lilly, who is joining us here in Ottawa. And she is an associate professor and associate director of the master's program at Carleton University, and it is an expert on trade and geoeconomics in this part of the world. Meredith, thanks again for joining us. So with that being said, we all know that you have distinguished goods to join this discussion. Jim, can you kick us off with a little bit of perspectives to start on Canada? This is obviously a topic that you've focused your entire career on. And now that you're outside of the bureaucratic realm, perhaps you can give us some less bureaucratic thoughts on where you think Canada is going, perhaps should be going, and will be going in this part of the region as it thinks on the Indo-Pacific. So Jim, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. You emphasized the fact that this was timely, and I would entirely endorse that sentiment, but I would suggest, in fact, that it is past time. In fact, if we go back 40 years, we see that trans-Pacific trade exceeded transatlantic trade. And we, that is to say Canada writ large, have been exceedingly slow to realize the full potential and challenges of what is now known as the Indo-Pacific region. It was many years ago that Paul Keating, who was then the Australian Prime Minister, referred to his land as the Lucky Land. And in fact, Keating might very well have been talking about Canada. Canada, vast, prosperous, militarily indigestible, flanked by huge oceanic moats, adjacent to a hugely powerful and largely benign neighbor. But I would suggest, despite the enormous good fortune of Canada and Canadians, we are a nation adrift. When the Prime Minister announced grandly some time ago that Canada was back, in fact, foreign policy analysts viewed that with cynicism and even with derision. Because I would suggest to you that sadly, and this grieves me as a loyal and proud Canadian, that Canada is becoming increasingly invisible, even irrelevant on the global stage. We have a populace which is comfortable, complacent, entitled, naive, and in many cases uninformed about the complexities and challenges of the Asia-Pacific region. Ottawa, I would suggest, has developed as an art form, excusing its shortcomings. What we need, as Jonathan had suggested, is urgency. But we need energy, we need vision, we need staying power. This is not a one-horse race. The Indo-Pacific region is vast, complex, enormously challenging, and we have to make some hard decisions and stay the course. The COVID pandemic and the war in the Ukraine should, I would argue, have been powerful wake-up calls for Canadians, shattering their complacency and naivety about how the international system works. Our military aid, I regret to say, has been pathetic and inadequate. 4 howitzers. We have gussied up paralysis in the form of prudence. What we're looking at is a truly existential global struggle for values, for the rule of law, for the maintenance of democracy. And I would suggest to all of our listeners that if we don't get the Ukraine right, the results will jeopardize the entire global balance. More specifically, when it comes to Canada and Asia, one could argue that the Madame Meng affair and the incarceration of the 2 Michaels gave Ottawa reason to pause before they made public announcements. But we have failed time after time to come to grips with the reality of the Pacific. Critical is presence. We simply are not there. I've said to senior colleagues, you may wonder why you've come all the way to Tokyo or all the way to Singapore, and you may say to yourself, this is a waste of time. But it's not a waste of time. If you don't show up, the people around you know. And that's one of the real challenges when we look at formulating policy with respect to the Asia-Pacific region. We simply do not have a track record. We're there sometimes, not other times. And when you look at the multilateral and minilateral agreements that have featured in recent events, whether it's AUKUS or the Quad and so on, the reason why there's no reference to Canada is that we're simply not there. We don't deliver, and we have to deliver. And even in Washington, we're beginning to hear murmurs about Canada as an unreliable partner. So we have to make some hard decisions, study the region intently, and have a real and prolonged presence. You can't be there one day and be gone and expect to have a reputation. Let me leave it there, Jonathan, and we'll re-enter all of this in the Q&A later. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jim. What a way to kick it off. And I would say here on all of that, many things to sort of tease out there, and much of it we will do during the moderated discussion. But just before I turn to Tom, a couple quick sort of points. I think you're right. Showing up is important. And when we say showing up too, I mean, I think a lot of it obviously is on the hands of the Canadian government, but I think also is in the form of private sector, in addition to think tanks and academics, which I think play an important role as well. The second important thing, I think, is not just showing up, but also what you say and the things that you prioritize. And again, this goes back to the empathy point of showing up's important, but things you prioritize and making sure that you listen, sometimes actually before you speak, I think is an important part in this part of the world. So we understand both what our partners and our budding partners actually want of Canada before we start sort of making commitments. And the last point I would make before turning this over to Tom is that the consistency element, the idea of really making this a sustained long-term presence, rather than this sort of in and out, sort of fly-by sort of approach, I think is really important. So with that being said, can I move it on to Tom? Tom, for your thoughts from Australia.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Jonathan, for convening this this very timely webinar, and it's a privilege to be joining esteemed colleagues to discuss such important issues. Now, Jim has provided an excellent segue to my own remarks on how others view Canada's presence or lack of it within the region from the Australian perspective. And since, I'd like to just add the rider that sometimes advice from other countries on how to run national policy, even from friends like Australia, can raise hackles. And I've been brought to book by Canadian colleagues before for speaking fairly robustly on how Australia views the situation in Canada. It's good to hear that Jim has kind of actually created a space where I can make some fairly robust interventions on this score. So I might just begin with an anecdote just to set the scene for my insights. Well, every year, one of Australia's premier foreign policy think tanks, the Lilly Institute for International Policy, it produces a data-driven report called the Asia Power Index, which seeks to capture a spectrum of metrics in order to rank relative power differentials in the Indo-Pacific. Well, Canada is not included in this index or anywhere in the accompanying report, which may speak volumes for how strategic analysts view Canada within the region. Now, of course, this might be just an editorial choice on the part of the authors, but I really do think that it speaks volumes that a significant middle power state like Canada can be overlooked like this, whilst countries like Nepal, Laos and Brunei all feature in the index. So this kind of Canada passing by like-minded Australia of all countries would sort of seem to defy expectations, because both these countries, they enjoy shared histories, values, interests, and often Canada and Australia are mentioned in the same breath as archetypical middle powers that take proactive roles in regionalism, multilateralism, coalition building, and are known for their kind of all-round good international citizenship. Now, it's not to say that the two countries are exactly symmetrical in their national and strategic cultures. It's often quipped that Australia is from Mars and Canada is from Venus, and this might account for the more kind of robust defence-orientated stance that Canberra has adopted, but I don't think it's really sufficient to account for the disparity in terms of their regional engagement. I mean, look at the dilatory fashion in which Ottawa has sort of reluctantly approached the whole Indo-Pacific concept over the last kind of 5 years, where it really took off, and compare this with Canberra's avid embrace of this to frame its regional policy. I mean, for Australia, the Indo-Pacific concept has been present everywhere as in the strategic discourse, but also as an active driver in the process of many of the prominent institutions in the region, particularly things like Quad and AUKUS, aside from the multilateral architecture. Ottawa, once a champion of organizations such as APEC, hovers on the margins, neither properly in nor out. For example, Canada is a member of the Comprehensive Agreement towards Trans-Pacific Partnership, but it's not a member of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership (RCEP) or the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework (IPEF). So, this really gets to the core of what we're talking about here, which is Canada lacking this specific national Indo-Pacific strategy as per the US and all of the other variations that Jonathan had mentioned amongst the European powers and so forth. Now, Australia doesn't have a specific document called Indo-Pacific strategy, but it's very easy to see when you pass together the different documentation, the statements and everything, that we do enunciate a very clearly defined approach to the Indo-Pacific, a sort of small case Indo-Pacific strategy around solid support for the Japanese and American versions of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, or the FOIP. And this is also something that unifies the Quad now officially. And the way that Canada has sort of been so tepid in its embrace of the Indo-Pacific and the FOIP policies of its allies and partners, is quite a contrast. And I know there's been quite a vigorous debate going on between those that advocate a more proactive role for Australia and a more explicit adoption of the FOIP, where others have advocated against it. I mean, there's probably some good reasons for this, and we might get onto this later. But in terms of Canada looking across multiple oceans, and whereas Australia is very much at the geopolitical heart of the Indo-Pacific construct, and we can come back to those later, but. Also, I think, another reason for Canada is, we've started to talk about urgency, and, and Canberra saw this urgency right from the get-go, whereas I think, Ottawa is very much, as it's been said, coming late to the table. But given the significance of the Indo-Pacific region as the heart of the global economy and the acute tensions that are going on in the strategic environment, Canada can't really afford to take such a passive role, as a matter of national interest. And also, there's the reputational costs of Canada not being more forthcoming in its support for allies and partners that Jim very much alluded to, because we keenly anticipate, we keenly expect a more prolific role from Ottawa in this vital region, and so that does have those kind of reputational costs as a less reliable partner, again, that Jim had alluded to. So just to conclude, I mean, I think it's a near certainty that Canada would welcome a more proactive Canadian role within the region. Especially at this point in time, where just about every other significant power, including the US, Japan, India, the UK, France, Germany, and even the Netherlands, are proactively forging these Indo-Pacific strategies. Canada's effective absence at the table, when it has potentially a great deal to offer, is sorely missed. So, I would very much, I very much recognise and very much echo the points that Jim had introduced, and this is very much how things are viewed from the Australian perspective as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. I think that's really important insights. Very strong and somewhat sobering, but I think that's what we need, a message, from our Australian friends. I think your note on Canada passing, I think, is important. And in some of the discussions that I've been having recently with friends from the region, I'm hearing less of a irritant towards Canada and almost sort of an irrelevance. So when thinking about for example, when talking to some American friends about our lack of presence in the Indo-Pacific strategy, I don't think it was this is an intentional snub of Canada because you weren't fast enough on 5G network, for example. But I think it actually was sorry, we didn't even think of that. We didn't think of putting you in. So what is worse in a way is being snubbed intentionally or not even being snubbed at all. Is one thing to put onto. But I think that was very interesting, Tom. And I think we'll come back to AUKUS and Quad later on in the discussion. If we can move on now to Tokyo and to Fukushima Sensei for some of your thoughts from Japan, to look at how Japan is looking at this crisis, both in Europe, but also with its first and foremost thoughts on the Indo-Pacific. I understand Japan has new national security legislation that will be coming out at the end of this year. So Fukushima Sensei, we welcome your thoughts from Japan on the Indo-Pacific, and also if you have any remarks on the Japan-Canada relationship, that would be very welcome. Please, virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity to join this important and timely webinar. I think the COVID-19 pandemic and Russian aggression to Ukraine have brought us to a new phase in our security thinking. As Jonathan said, Japanese government is revising our national security strategy and two defense documents by the end of the year. There are so many things that we have to delve into and map out our future plan. In my opening remark, as was mentioned by Jonathan, I would like to discuss 2 points. One, Japan's reaction to Ukraine war in relation to implications to the Indo-Pacific, and secondly, possible cooperation among Japan, Canada, and the like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific. First on Japan's reaction to Ukraine war has been reputed as a major shift from its position at the time of the Russian invasion to Crimea in 2014. On February 24th, 2022, Prime Minister Kishida condemned the Russian aggression to Ukraine as a grave breach of international law. It is unacceptable for Japan to witness Russian unilateral action to change the status quo by force. Japan has acted together with the G7, not leaving a loophole on our concerted efforts towards Russia for ceasefire. Specifically, Japan has taken sanctions that include the freezing of assets of persons related to the government of Russia, including Mr. Putin, exclusion of selected Russian banks from the SWIFT system. It is also important to show high cost one has to pay by changing status quo unilaterally by force. Japan has supported Ukraine with drones, bulletproof vests, helmets, and others. Japan has provided emergency humanitarian assistance of US $700 million to Ukraine and its neighbors. Currently, Japan Air Self-Defense Force is in UAE to transport goods stockpiled in UAE by UNHCR to Poland and Romania. I'd like to remind you that Japan has taken these measures despite our intricate relations with Russia. Japan has its northern territorial issues with Russia still unresolved. Japan relies on energy supply from Russia, most notably LNG supply from Sakhalin. Nevertheless, Japan has decided to take these strict measures to Russia to bring about ceasefire. Why? It is because of its implications to the Indo-Pacific. If Japan tolerates Russian violation of international law, which shatters fundamental international order, it may trigger similar actions in the Indo-Pacific. Jonathan, at the outset, cited the Prime Minister Kishida's remark at Shangri-La Dialogue, which was, Ukraine today may be the East Asia tomorrow. Many in Japan view that Chinese moves on Taiwan will depend on future evolution of the Ukrainian war. In Japan, there are a whole range of views on this question, ranging from Taiwan will be next Ukraine to Russian invasion is not contiguous. Also, stepped up joint exercises by Russian and Chinese militaries in the neighborhood of Japan have deepened our concern. Moreover, we are concerned that Russian threat to use nuclear weapons to Ukraine has deepened the conviction of DPRK that it should develop missiles and nuclear weapons for their regime survival, as demonstrated by their frequent test launches. These concerns have led the calls in Japan to spend more on defense, possibly 2% of our GDP in 5 years. Lastly, let me allude to Canada's role in the Indo-Pacific. Since the launch of Free and Open Indo-Pacific Vision, FOIP, Japan has promoted the vision as an inclusive concept, not as a containment strategy. Prime Minister Kishida mentioned at Shangri-La Dialogue that he will lay out a free and open Indo-Pacific plan for peace by next spring. Under the banner of FOIP, Japan has promoted a rule of law-based international order, physical and digital connectivity, and maritime security. Japan plans to further promote capacity building of the maritime law enforcement capabilities in the region. Here, it will be very conducive to maritime security in the region if Canada can join our efforts in capacity building for maritime security. Canada and Japan are cooperating as members of the G7 on Russian invasion to Ukraine. Moreover, Canada is a member of NATO, while Japan is a partner country. Since our security in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific indivisible, I hope we can cooperate in framing further cooperation among NATO and its willing partners in the Indo-Pacific, including Australia and others. I believe the current international situation demands multiplexed cooperation, combining bilateral, trilateral, plurilateral, and multilateral frameworks depending on the challenge or depending on objectives. I will be happy to delve into further points during the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fukushima-sensei. That was really excellent comments, and again, lots to unpack there. I liked your referencing also of the challenges on the Korean Peninsula, because often, when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, there is a large country that we've mentioned several times. It's obviously on our mind and should be on our mind, but there are more challenges than just those posed by China. I think the proliferation concerns on the Korean Peninsula are one of the important ones that you mentioned, and obviously first and foremost for Japanese strategists. So thank you for mentioning that. And the second thing that I thought was interesting was this idea of being an impact multiplier as well. I think for the Canada and Japan relationship, it's a very important relationship. They sit in many forums, but they don't necessarily take advantage of that. And I think of looking at the different ways that you can multiply that, whether it's the bilateral, whether it's G7, G20, PEC, regional forum. We're in so many different bodies with the Japanese, and I think we share so many different interests and values with them that really taking advantage of that relationship and including that into the trilaterals, as you mentioned, or the minilaterals, I think is a necessary step. So thank you so much, Fukushima-sensei, for those really great insights. Now, if we can move a little bit in a different direction in the Pacific to Honolulu, and John, can you please take the virtual floor?
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and a very big thank you to MLI for organizing such an important topic of discussion. Quickly add a caveat that although I'm a professor at a Department of Defense Regional Center for the United States, I speak on my own behalf. I'm just a lowly bureaucratic professor who hopes to spawn some interesting discussion. I think I'll start off by laying out like the sort of three myths about the Indo-Pacific that would be useful for Canadian audiences to put to rest. The first myth is that the Indo-Pacific concept or the Indo-Pacific strategy is a sort of US-led thing. The second is that it's about containing China. And the third is that it's security-centric. All three are, have some elements of truth to them, but they're myths in the sense that while the U.S. is seen by many states as a sort of leader, the actual origin of the concept and the strategies that many countries have adapted lie outside of Washington. And first, it's very nice to follow the Japanese speaker, because in many ways the Americans are following Japan's origin of this strategy. And also, in fact, the Australians also led on this. Secondly, it's not been about containing China. I think there's been a China element to it. People are concerned when a rising power that, although it lifts, 100, 200 million people out of poverty, also has an authoritarian government and acts out in the region in ways that are distressing or concerning to its neighbors. This sort of sets a little bit of a response. But I would say that the Indo-Pacific concept that many countries are sharing is not so much about containing China or blocking China. It's more about what do we stand for. So as China rises, it can sort of understand what the interests of the region are. You'll hear human rights mentioned. You hear sort of open markets as well as open and free access on the maritime side. And you also hear about in some ways a response to Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. You'll see the demands for well funded and well financed and infrastructure development, something that the region it really needs. And then and that sort of answers the third myth, that it's security centric. It does have a component to that in the maritime access, that all states want to have free access to their shipping lanes and not be restricted by a state that unilaterally builds military bases across those. Canada's not sort of coming to a party too late. I'll note that the Europeans, likewise, with a very transatlantic centric frame of mind, have come rather late to it, but they are just edging ahead of Canada. And why are all these states doing it? Why is everyone ready? Is it because Washington says so? Not really. What's happening is, the military, political, and economic force for the region is moving to the region. You see the rule makers there, and you also see the rule breakers there. And so, in a sense, as it was with Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, states that want to be a part of this new discussion, this dialogue between a rising China, a rising India, a rising Southeast Asia, they sort of want to be in the room per se, and so you have to be at the tables. I'm very pleased to see Canada is sort of coming to the table. We have, in the security sense, obviously, 2 Canadian vessels coming to RIMPAC, one of the largest military exercises in about a month and a half's time. We also have a slew of visits through Honolulu and through the U.S. components that are forward deployed into the region. And of course, you've just had a wonderful speaker at the Shangri-La Dialogue, one of the region's foremost discussions of regional security. And I know there's a Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy that to be released soon, which I'm sure everyone certainly on the U.S. side, on the Allied side, we're very keen to read and very keen to work with Canada. The elements that are going to be a challenge, of course, if Canada doesn't issue a strategy, as some of the other speakers have alluded to, they sort of risk getting left out of the wider discussions about the regional and global rules setting that are sort of taking place. But what are the risks of going in? Well, there is the risk, of course, of as all states have faced, as a sort of backlash from the PRC, which tends to view the term as a sort of American stalking horse to contain them. And they sort of ignore the Indo part of it, which really speaks to a lot of the country's desire for both China and India to have a leading role in the future of Asian integration. So there is that risk, but is it a serious risk to Canada's trade or Canada's security? Not really. If the Netherlands can do it, I'm sure Canada is more than able. Having said that, the other risks, even after a strategy that occurs, is that while all of us are on a similar page, we all have similar strategies, but not exactly the same. Is how do we deal with a rising power to which we are all deeply committed politically and economically to deep relations? But with almost 2 years of COVID behind us, fewer and fewer Canadians, Americans, and Europeans in Beijing to talk directly to Beijing and to prevent misunderstandings and conflict over a Taiwan contingency, I think, are getting higher. And there's really, my personal opinion is that I think there's really a serious potential for escalation. We've seen with Ukraine, the PRC has sort of bought the lemon, but they're still going to drive it. They are sticking with the Russian side. And they tend to now view the Ukraine war as a sort of accident of U.S. policies. And many of the discussions they're having now with many regional and global states about the Indo-Pacific tend to point, all the faults, all the criticism they receive it's all essentially down to the United States. And so I find that very worrying that they're unable to have that self-inspection and understand that their own, the response they get from the region is to some extent by their own behavior. So I hope that as Canada enters in the region, it can be its own voice in helping get our Chinese friends and colleagues some self-understanding of how their actions are perceived in region. So with that, I'll turn the mic over to Jonathan, and thank you again for letting me speak.
So much, John. That's really helpful, and I'm really glad that you started your talk on the intellectual origins, because I think that's an important point that often gets missed as the thought, especially with your previous administration in Washington. And often I use the word forced plagiarization. I think the Japanese were very happy to sort of say, okay, please plagiarize our free and open Indo-Pacific. But I think you're right. I think this basically developed in the region. The Japanese, the Australians, and the Indians can fight over who was the intellectual grandparents of it, but I believe they all had a hand in it. And the U.S. has a hand in it too. But I think it's important, especially thinking about this from a Canadian context. As much as we love our American neighbors, we share so much. Obviously, as you know, Canadians, we love to complain about our neighbors too. As you may as well in the United States. So that's an important point to make, because when we're thinking about we have to look at this not just through the American prism, but through the prism of our other partners in this region. That being said, I also think it's important not to look at the U.S. approach to this and just sort of take it back and say, well, we can't be that. We have to be different from that. The reality is, and I very much hope and expect in this strategy process, that 85 to 90, or maybe even more, of the strategy will align very closely with the United States. And it's in our interest to do many things with the United States that we're already doing. So I think we have to accept that reality, embrace that reality, and not look at it as an aversion or something that we should walk away from. And the last point that I thought was really great was the security-centric element. Obviously, I think the strategies are diverse. The way that the world is now is not as it was 50 years ago, where we could just put trade on one side and put national security on the other side. They're integrated, obviously. But I would one point on this is that definitely the strategies are not security-centric, and we should be thinking about this region in purely in security terms. But at the same point, we can't have strategies that are completely bereft of security, and the idea that this is there's nothing to see here. So this might be my worry in the Canadian case. Of course, we are doing things in defense and security terms, but we may try to walk in and essentially say, well, we want to trade in this region. We understand the security implications, but the large-scale security things, they're not for us. Basically, that's the job of the Americans and the Japanese and others. I think that would be a mistake. So I think there needs to be a balance there of course, not focusing your strategy only on security and defense, but at the same point, not ignoring that this is a fundamental reality, not just in Tokyo, not just in Australia, but in Southeast Asia and India, etc. So on that, I will, last but not least, Meredith here in Ottawa, I will turn it over to you to give us the concluding thoughts from Canada, and then we'll move on to the moderated discussion. So Meredith, the virtual floor is yours.
Great. Thanks very much, Jonathan. And as John was speaking, saying the Americans weren't first, I turned to my bookshelf. I know we all have these wonderful COVID bookshelves, but mine actually has stuff on it that I read occasionally. So this is the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper by Australia, and is full of stuff about the Indo-Pacific. So certainly Japan and Australia have been thinking and talking about these things and publishing about it in actual white papers for quite some time. So I think it's obvious why the Indo-Pacific has to be an important and central part of Canada's foreign policy in the coming decades. You know, this is the fastest growing and most dynamic economic region in the world. 60% of the world's population and 40% of its economic output are in that region. But as John said, there's also potential for really serious geopolitical economic challenges that are developing. In part, that's due to China. Some of this is recent Russian bad behavior. And also, I think, because there are some major economies in that region that can chart their own path, and they can do so without reliance on Canada's traditional allies of the United States and Europe. And so I think that we're in this era in which economic interests can no longer be separated from broader foreign policy and defense objectives. So this is the point that Jonathan just made. And I think this is something that makes Canada really uncomfortable. We have long sought to benefit from economic growth in the Indo-Pacific without getting our hands dirty in some of the deeper defense and foreign policy challenges. Some of that's because it's expensive. And I think, though, some of it is also what I regard as a desire, particularly by the current Canadian government, to look at the Indo-Pacific region really through a very self-interested domestic lens, both economically as well as politically. And I think that it's no longer possible to separate those things as neatly as we would have liked to. We can't just be in the CPTPP and not be thinking about what's happening in maritime security, for instance. So I think this started certainly more than 5 years ago, but this has really been cemented by Russia's invasion in Ukraine. And Canada now has to work with allies to link our economic interests in the region with our foreign policy and defense policy objectives. So as I said, I think that makes the current government uncomfortable. I think it also makes our foreign service and global affairs uncomfortable. So the three things I think that I'm looking for, worrying about as Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy is developed and unveiled, our first, this has already been mentioned, but it's something I prepared and put in my notes. And the fact that all of us kind of are recognizing the problem of Canada's timing, I think is something worth underscoring. So, we are very late to the party. We are sort of the last ones on the dance floor, and there's maybe no one left to dance with. And I do worry that we are potentially placing ourselves in a position of isolation from like-minded allies. The US, Australia, Japan, they all have this, coordinated, concerted path for the region, and we're not part of it. And we should be really worried about that and the reasons for it. And so I worry about that. I also worry that our strategy is useful to and responsive to the interests of countries in the region and what they want from Canada. The second thing that I think about is how to triangulate our interests with the US-China rivalry. In the last decade, Canada, I think, has looked to China as sort of this counterweight to our trade dependence with the United States. And we've sought to diversify via China to really replace one big market with another. And I think that was a strategic error on Canada's part and something that we need to move away from. The reality is that the United States is our biggest and most important trading partner. Among CPTPP partners, both Canada and Mexico share the fact that 60% of our bilateral trade is with the Americans, and all other countries in the CPTPP rely on the US for less than 20% of their bilateral trade. And by contrast, their major partner typically is China. And so as we see US-China rivalry increasing in the coming years, I think all countries in the region, everybody else really does want to avoid choosing sides. They don't want to be put in a position of choosing sides. But I think there are moments where choices need to be made. One recent one for Canada was the Huawei 5G decision. We took 3 years to make it because we were so incredibly uncomfortable with picking sides on this issue. There are more coming down the pipe. I think other digital governance issues are coming. Critical mineral assets are both areas where I expect choices are going to have to be made. And, for Canada, the choice, I think, will generally be a clear one. As I already said, the United States is our biggest and most important trading partner. It's also our next door neighbor. And so our Indo-Pacific strategy has to reflect that orientation. And then the last thing is, and this has been mentioned as well, is that we have to be relevant and consistent in the region. The criticisms of Canada in forums like ASEAN and APEC that I've participated in the past is that we're inconsistent. We're sort of this fair weather friend. And so how do we demonstrate our long-term interest in the region beyond this sort of transactional economic benefit that we kind of have a reputation for? So, I'd like to see a plan for development of fragile countries in the region. I would like to see deep economic governance elements around things like labor and environment, and also security interests that support our countries in the region who feel threatened. We haven't talked much about Taiwan, but I think that that's a country that we need to keep central to our concern. And so those are some of the things that I worry about when I think about the direction of our strategy.
Thanks so much, Meredith. That's really helpful. And I liked your analogy on the dance party. No one likes to be left out of a dance party or be the last one there. Maybe we would have the Italians or the Swiss there still left to dance with. But I agree that the dance floor is looking very, very thin at this point. And I think it's the urgency really needs to be underlined. So this is excellent. I'd like to move in now to the moderated discussion. And I think, Meredith, this is something that you actually brought up, but this is, even Jim, when he started his comments, I think was hinting at this. And I think you framed it as comfort. And I think this is a point I'd like to go back onto, because this comfort zone that I think Canada has found itself in. And I'd like to hear the views of other partners here that have spoken tonight on this. Because often I, look at the Ukraine crisis and Russia's war in Ukraine as an example of this. So we have ministers, prime ministers, deputy ministers, foreign affairs ministers repeatedly traveling to the region. Obviously, it's great. They should be there. They should be addressing our interests and the challenges there. But I hesitate to think what would happen in such a contingency in the Indo-Pacific. And you brought up Taiwan. Whether this is something in Taiwan, what sort of reaction would we see from the Canadian side politically, bureaucratically? How would we move? How would we mobilize? What level of importance would we put on this? And this goes to the element of comfort. I feel like when it comes to engaging in Europe in particular, and I often make this point that I think Canadian politicians anyways, and probably bureaucrats too, are more comfortable in Europe than we are in the United States. When we travel there, we feel with the multilateral architecture that we're used to dealing with the political dynamics that we're used to dealing with, it's very comfortable. And we feel that this fits in our tidy image of the way foreign policy should be conducted. I guess what I'm hinting at here, and maybe it's obvious, is that the Indo-Pacific is not as comfortable as this. It's not as tidy. And I think Fukushima Sensei and Tom and John also brought this up, referencing the need for multilaterals in tandem with minilaterals, such as AUKUS and the Quad. And I think this goes to my first kind of question for the panel is, how can Canada sort of adapt to this? So, we're tethered to this idea and this almost religion that multilateralism is there to cure all ills. But I think what we're realizing, especially in this part of the world, is that multilateralism, of course, is important. I think we need to stress the importance and look to build up the strength in ASEAN. But it's absolutely not sufficient to deal with the challenges. I think that's the reason why we've seen the outgrowth of some of these strong unilaterals. So I wonder whether Canada will be able to recognize this, whether we should be able to recognize this, and what sort of role that you see us playing balancing this growth in minilateralism alongside multilateralism. So if I can start, Jim, with you at the top, and then maybe everyone can have a chance to comment.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. A couple of quick observations. One is a worrying cultural reluctance, I think, to come to grips with the hard issues in life. One has only to look at the paucity of muscular, well thought out foreign policy white papers in Canada in the past 25 years. It seems as if GAC has in many ways been fatally weakened over that period, and there is a deep bureaucratic reluctance to wrestle with the real issues of what is important for Canada going forward. And we can see that lack of achievement also in other departments in Ottawa. And much of that, I think, is hidden by a proclivity for self-congratulation, that we always manage to find excuses for our failure to function more dramatically and our lack of real leadership and vision. I think in the Pacific, we have to continue with multilateralism. Multilateralism enables modest to middle-sized powers to leverage their way upwards in many fora. But it is the minilaterals which indicate the real pressure points. That's where pragmatism begins to clutch in. And we have been noticeably and dangerously absent from those discussions. One can argue the toss with things like AUKUS and so on about nuclear submarines and so forth, but the fact of the matter remains that we're on the sidelines looking in. And so we've got to be much more aggressive in the positive sense of the word. And as I suggested in my formal comments, at stake is not only security, is not only trade, but a global contestation for values. And what we see is that the values that we hold dear are being threatened. If we're not prepared to say to ourselves that we've got to make some real sacrifices, then we could very easily see those values going to the wall. Thank you.
That's great, Jim. And I think it's a good segue. I'm going to move to Tom next. But, you know, I like your point, especially on the different minilaterals. And I often find there's a sentimentality here in Canada. You know, if the Indo-Pacific was a train that was moving at a fast clip, we feel like there's always a seat for us there. And at any time we could jump in and get in that seat. And often what I've been saying is that the train is very fast, and not to say people don't like Canada or don't want Canada, but I don't think that there's necessarily a bunch of folks that are waiting for Canada. An example of this would be, I think, AUKUS and the Quad. While we study about should we be in it, should we not, we know what the political line on this is. The reality is to join a club, you have to be invited. And I don't believe that we've been formally invited either. So I think we need to understand the profound implications of that before thinking about how we would join and what we would provide. So Tom, let me pass it off to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I very much like the fact that Fukushima Sensei mentioned this concept of multiplex, that there's all kinds of different components to the regional architecture. And now, of course, it's incredibly complex, especially with all these new organizations or institutions emerging. I think we need to remember that that these different institutions, these different constellations of small groupings and so forth, they serve in many ways functionally different purposes. I mean, there's horses for courses. So, you know, multilateral security dialogue forums are great for, you know, for dialogue, exchange of views, confidence building measures. But again, you know, I think I'm in very close alignment with Jim in terms of how I perceive these things. But the sort of the real action where things get done, whether the hard issues get dealt with, this is increasingly migrating to minilaterals, probably in you know, response to dissatisfaction with the sort of the gridlock in the bigger multilaterals. So I think, you know, the multilateral dialogues are, you know, these mechanisms are still important for dialogue and, you know, and CBMs and everything. And we're also seeing a bit more activity in the economic sphere of multilateralism as well. So, I mean, you know, Canada, again, as I mentioned before, you know, Canada's engagement with this has been patchy, and showing up to all of these things could be very important. So perhaps reconsidering RCEP, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, and so forth might be useful. And then it's worth just inserting a little kind of rider on there that I think, you know, again, Jim was alluding to, which is, you know, the security and the economic dimensions of, you know, what's going on in the region are not separate and compartmentalized for any nation, but also as a region as a whole. And so, you know, increasingly we're seeing security dimensions to economics as well. So, I mean, if you thought it was all smooth sailing on the economics track while security, or that's a bit, you know, that's a bit sensitive for Canada, it's not smooth sailing on the economics track anymore because of the, you know, use of economic statecraft, economic coercion, or secure supply chains. This is all becoming security now. The two are sort of together. But yeah, I would just sort of, you know, finish by saying that I think, you know, from my perspective, the minilaterals are where things are getting done in the security sphere, and that's not limited to traditional strategic, you know, military concerns, but also includes some of the economic security as well. So I do think that the minilaterals have a strong security and defense emphasis in the case of AUKUS. For Canada, you know, it might be appropriate, or there might be some scope for sort of like coming closer to Quad in the kind of Quad plus formula. Other countries have done that already. So, you know, so there could be space for that, at least in the initial stages. I think AUKUS is a little bit more specific with its core aims, but around the margins, some of the things about technological defense cooperation and everything, and also with Japan as well, as a sort of an AUKUS plus or affiliate of AUKUS. These might also be productive things to think about for Ottawa. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Tom. It's some great insights, and I think especially on economic security is a good segue to pass it over to Fukushima Sensei for your thoughts on this question.
I also concur with Tom on security side and minilateralism, but let me try to make 2 quick points. One is a comfort zone. Japan is having a very difficult time securing comfort zone for its own activities. We live right next to China, and Japan has maintained dialogue and deterrence policies vis-a-vis China. Balancing act of the two are getting more difficult, tougher than ever. But in implementing FOIP, we also try to cooperate with China, and Japan has cooperated on the BRI project on a project-to-project basis. So there is a very delicate balancing that we have made with China. Our economic interdependence is quite heavy, should I say, or deep. And on the second point about dance floor, Indo-Pacific or free and open Indo-Pacific dance floor is different from other traditional dance floor, in my view. That means we do not dance with predetermined or prearranged partners, but we dance together, maybe in a group of 2, group of 3, and more. For instance, with Canada, Japan, if I'm wrong, please correct me, but Japan and Canada have agreed to promote FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific, at the Prime Minister's level on 6 areas. So on this dancing floor, Japan and Canada have started to dance together. And if Canada will announce its strategy, that would widen our scope of cooperation. I have given capacity building in maritime security, maritime law enforcement earlier, and with Jim's experience in the past, I hope we can dance together on capacity building. So that's what I meant by multiplexed system. Depending on the gender or depending on the objective, we can dance in different groups. And that's something we should look for in this multiplexed system. Free and open Indo-Pacific, or whatever you call it, is very unique in terms of multilateral cooperation. It doesn't start from institution building, it doesn't start from membership, but it started from respective individual strategy or vision. And in implementing, we dance together depending on our interests. So we are going into a brand new stage in our combination of bilateral to multilateral. Have I made myself clear? Thank you.
That's great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for those insights. And we have a great 5-person dance happening right now, virtually anyways. And with that, my next dance partner, John, please, your thoughts on this.
I really appreciate the comments made by Fukushima Sensei and Professor Wilkins, in the sense that it strikes me that these security relationships, broadly speaking, AUKUS, the Quad, and so on, sort of have taken up the slack that the regional architecture has left. In many ways, there are things like ASEAN Regional Forum and the SARC and other regional groups that have their security components, but we've noted that the region generally has not figured out how to use those for some of the toughest issues effectively. And so what you're having is a development of these other groups. There is a little bit of a propensity I've noticed with my Canadian colleagues to mention NATO as a potential framework for the region. It's not clear to anyone yet here or in Brussels about, to what extent NATO can reach that far. Certainly, the new concept, strategic concept, will have some element about China, which has been widely discussed. But whether that's China in the world and China in Europe rather than NATO in the Indo-Pacific is really, I think you'll find a lot of resistance from NATO countries who are right next to revanchist Russia to expand the mission profile there. Although they will, expand to some extent, but it will be limited in the important ways. There are other bodies, though. The Five Eyes is not just an intelligence body; it also includes sort of military interoperability and communications and multiple agreements. And we've seen over the last few years a sort of Five Eyes diplomacy where the five ministers have issued joint communiques, and it's not always been unanimous, and there's been a lot of pushback with it. I've actually written a paper with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's support on exactly this expansion, and it strikes me as one of these new cells, these new, if you think of chainmail armor rather than one NATO armor plate, we have lots of different little groupings that seem to be developing between like-minded states. And I agree with, with Fukushima Sensei saying that you have to find the right dance partner for your needs and what you're looking for. AUKUS is obviously very bespoke. But the good thing about AUKUS, I think, to Canadians is it shows that regional partners are hungry for extra-regional nations. The UK is very far from the region. And a lot of people in the UK, when I used to be based in London, were sort of, how would the UK link up in security architectural terms with the region? No one really had any answers to that until this September, when suddenly the AUKUS was born. So it shows you that right now there's a very fluid time. There's a desire for security architecture beyond what the regional bodies are providing. And I think all Canada has to do is really start to figure out which tune it wants to dance to and what its natural interests are and what it can contribute, and quickly move from there. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, John. I think that's a great point of, as you framed it, extra-regional actors taking part in the Indo-Pacific. And I think of even the Shangri-La dialogue and the growth of that dialogue over the past few years and who's attending at a high level versus who would have attended that 5 years ago, 10 years ago. One example of that, and I think he was unable to attend due to the pandemic, actually, but Borrell from the European Union was slated to attend that. So you see that there's different actors that are not necessarily seen as principal actors that are increasingly putting very little attention to this world, and should do so as well. Meredith, last word to you on this.
I'll be really quick because I think a lot of the important issues have been covered. I think, though, when Canada and Canadian officials have never met a multilateral table they didn't want to sit at, and we love this. We want to be at every table. We want to be invited to every single table that exists, and we want to sit at it. And I think that one of the real challenges of that is that we have to do more than just be at tables. We have to do things. We have to commit to action, and we have to bring resources. And so, where you can separate out some of those fora that are largely talk oriented and move towards action is in these mini laterals. And I think that's where the real work is happening. But to be invited to those, and I think that's an important point that you made earlier, Jonathan. We're not being invited to some of these important mini-lateral groupings, and I think that's because we're not bringing resources and we're not bringing real commitments, and it also means sometimes taking difficult stances on some issues, and we seem to want to ride kind of all the positions a lot of the time. And, I recently wrote a paper for CG about some of these issues, and I was looking through all the different Indo-Pacific strategies that different countries have rolled out. And the US strategy that was released in February, so not the more recent IPEF, but its document released several months ago, 18 pages long, lists a whole bunch of countries that the US sees as relevant and important and vital to the Indo-Pacific. And the word Canada doesn't appear once. We're just we're just not there. And so I think that in order to be at minilateral tables, we have to bring real commitments to action, and hopefully the Indo-Pacific strategy will articulate some of those. And perhaps if we have some articulated action prepared, then we will be seen as more relevant to the region.
Thanks so much, Meredith. Thanks very much. I mean, you're right that there aren't many clubs that we don't. If we had a point card, we want every point card that we could get. So that's definitely the case. And I think your point on being proactive is a good one too. That, I mean, rather than just looking at this reactively, studying the issues, and we often hear the term, consult with our allies. I mean, it's great to consult with your allies, but at some point you have to have your own original ideas and thoughts and strategies as well. So I think that's a point well taken. I think I'm going to move in now to, we have a lot of really good audience questions here, and I want to move into some of them. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I want to start, and please, for the audience questions, let's try to be as brief as possible so we can try to get as many of them as we can. One that I found is very intriguing, and we've talked about Taiwan a little bit already today, but this question that comes from the audience, from Michael, asks, what would the impact be on Canada? And when I say Canada here, let's talk about the region also. So for those guests from the United States, Japan, and Australia, feel free to talk a little bit more regionally. What would be the impact if China was able to absorb Taiwan within the next 5 years? So it's a big, big question. We don't know the dynamics of how this absorption would take place, but let's just go into the assumption, whether it's through significant force or not. That Taiwan, we wake up 5 years from now, and Taiwan is now part of the People's Republic of China. What does this mean? How do we assess the future of the Indo-Pacific at that point? So on this very difficult question, maybe I'll start back with you, Meredith, and then sort of make my way up.
I'm not sure I'm the best one to start with this, because I find it difficult to even ponder that reality. I think that we would find ourselves in a pretty different world if that were to take place. And I can speak to some of the trade pieces, but I really think this is more of a security question. So I'm gonna punt that one to some of the folks in the region, or security experts, who can think about it in those terms.
Okay, thanks. John, please.
I think, of course, we're trying to say, well, what are the results, whether or not it's been unified through force or through consent. It's sort of hard to talk about clearly an outcome without going through that first. I think if it was done through force, we'd see a very dangerous region. We'd see a region that would be as cold a Cold War as can be, with a Taiwan that sort of juts out and challenges and threatens South Korean and Japanese supply lines for Middle East oil and trade with Southeast Asia. We'd see certainly a PRC emboldened if it had successfully taken it by force and not really been punished economically or politically. Yeah, I think it would be a very distressing image if it were to occur peacefully, and that would certainly, it's possible. Although I have to say, the polls that show young Taiwanese identifying as Chinese are getting smaller and smaller percentage of total population, so it's less and less likely, unfortunately, for all of us, because it means we have to deal with this tension. If it were to occur peacefully, it does present us with a very even larger China in economic terms and technology terms, a China that would control the sophisticated end of the fabs that produce all the world's semiconductors, a China that sort of, even if it occurred peacefully, it would have solidified party control within China. They would have unified China, thus ending the 100 years of humiliation and perfecting Chinese socialism as we know it. So it would certainly present the image of a new resurgent sort of ideology on the world stage. Yeah, I think there's any number of directions I can go there, but you said keep it short, and I think I've already gone over, so I'll turn it back to you, Jonathan.
It's a tough question. It's a tough challenge, John. Thanks for those insights.
I gave it a try.
Let me modify that question, because I think you're right a little bit. So sort of add on to this question. Let's just go under the assumption that this is in some sort of form of force, whether it's forced consent or kinetic conflict that happens. Fukushima Sensei, how would Japan look? You wake up in 2027 June, all of a sudden Taiwan is now part of the People's Republic of China. Senkaku Islands are 100 kilometers away. How does Japan's strategic view look in 2027 if this is the case?
Japan is making its utmost efforts to prevent that to happen. If it takes place, the impact would be enormous. As I said in my opening remark, Japan is very much concerned on the implication of Russian aggression to Ukraine, on the Indo-Pacific, on the area. And I believe we must do everything possible not to let our neighbor to perceive that they can do things for their own liking without its own consequences, which will come back to them. So we really have to be clear in sending messages to our neighbor so that they wouldn't rock the boat over the strait. We must act together here. Everybody on the dance floor should act together to prevent. And Japan is looking into Chinese domestic policy making process, as well as their reaction to this aggression to Ukraine, and how China and Russia are going to act together in future, learning from the lessons of the case that happened this year. So my position is we should do our very best to prevent that to happen. And I believe China is quite wise in reading the situations.
Thanks so much. I think you're right. I think, so much needs to be focused on preemption, the planning, the war games, the scenarios that I think have been, a lot of folks probably around this virtual table have taken part in and have been thinking about for some years. I think that thinking needs to go much more bigger. I think it needs to go much wider within the bureaucracy. And I think this needs to be a consistent thing done not only between one or two countries or between three allies, but I think this is the Ukraine crisis, I think has shown that we would be thinking as a bigger group about how we would potentially deal with these situations, even though, of course, we don't want it to happen. I think we really need to be prepared and thinking about the different contingencies. So thank you. Tom.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I've been thinking about this more from the Japanese perspective, so I thoroughly take on board what Fukushima Sensei said. And the interesting thing is that both Australia and Japan, sometimes in the through the mechanism of their special strategic partnership, have voiced their concerns, about the Taiwan issue, sort of in tandem, which is an interesting development. Now, leaving aside some of the sort of more inflammatory comments that were made, well, perhaps both on the Australian and the Japanese side in previous months. I think what if this, and obviously this is highly speculative, but if the reunification took place through force, I think the things that would really alarm Australia, which would be not quite as much of a serious situation as for Japan, but the thing that would really alarm Australia would be that this is just the end of the rules-based order. This is an environment where might makes right, snuffing out a fellow democracy, the legitimization of the use of force to undertake territorial shifts, and so this would again, as John said, it would just completely change the whole shape of the region and how Australia would respond to the complete collapse of a rules-based and stable order. I think those would be the key things in any kind of sort of speculative scenario regards to Taiwan from Canberra's point of view.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Jim, you get the luxury of going last. You hear every instance, but I'm actually making it a little bit more difficult for you as you are going last, and sort of add another additional wrinkle onto this. We're talking obviously on the assumption that this is able to take place, but I think from a Canadian perspective, also say the absorption is in the midst, or say that we're in a contingency where there's a hot kinetic conflict over Taiwan. Often I hear this, maybe it's not an explicit sort of reference, but it seems like this is not our fight. This is something that basically is something the Americans have to deal with. The Japanese will be very concerned with. Perhaps the Australians, as a treaty ally in the Indo-Pacific, we may lend rhetorical support, but we don't necessarily see this as our conflict. I think that's fundamentally flawed from my own thinking. If the United States is involved in a hot conflict in the Indo-Pacific, we're absolutely involved in some manner. So I'd like you to comment on that, whether you feel like there'd be any possibility that the Canadian side could extricate ourselves. Number one, whether we are introduced, also whether that's even feasible, considering our geography and our links to the United States. In addition to the original question about if this absorption actually did take place.
Already, regrettably, have a reputation for freeloading in the realm of defense and security, and sending shoulder-launched platitudes is no support for Taipei. We have to be at the action, and that's comes back to the point that Meredith was making earlier, that you've got to come to the party with resources. And in some cases, those resources are real military hardware. And I don't say that in defense of defense, but simply because that's increasingly the coin of the realm in this Darwinian world in which we are located. And this is why a success in the Ukraine campaign is so critical for the West, in the sense that if the Russians succeed in the Ukraine, I think this will certainly embolden Xi. And Xi wants to be part of the great triumvirate in the sky of Mao, Deng, and Xi. And he wants this final piece, or almost final piece of the puzzle, to be reincorporated in China. What the Chinese never dare to mention, of course, is the huge area of the Russian Far East that was once part of China. They realized that that's too difficult, a bridge too far for reincorporation. Are we, as Canadians, going to stand by and watch a vibrant democracy in East Asia be overrun militarily? I don't think we will, or we should. But of course, there are enormous challenges. It's one thing for the Chinese to launch an invasion of Taiwan, but that's only 110 miles of open ocean. For the Americans, it's 5,000 miles of open ocean from the American West Coast to provide support for Taiwan. For the Japanese, there's a real threat. The Senkaku will go under in an instant, but so also, in my estimation, could many of the small islands in the Ryukyu chain that leads south from the home islands of the Japanese archipelago. And as Tom quite rightly suggested, what we would see is that might makes right. And the whole international order to which we're committed, and that was the background to my earlier emphasis on the contestation of values globally, that would be stood on its head. So this is a matter of enormous consequence, both in terms of diplomacy and in terms of how are we to position ourselves militarily to assist in the defense of Taiwan.
Thanks so much, Jim. Well, we're getting into the last 5 minutes, so we're going to go on a last rapid fire round, and I'm going to start with you, Jim. And I'm going to ask you very quickly in 1 or 2 sentences, and I'm going to ask all the other colleagues the same question. But the 2 Canadian colleagues get an extra question, so the Canadians will get 3 because I'm making it a little bit more difficult for my Canadian friends, and everyone else will just have to answer 2. So the 2 questions for everyone is if you were sitting in front of the Minister of Foreign Affairs about the strategy, what is Canada missing when it thinks about the Indo-Pacific? We've talked about many different issues, but if you could just sum this up in 1 sentence to the Minister, what are we missing when we think about this region? And the second part of that is, how can we address that? So how can we address this missing element of the way that we think about this region, our presence? So that would be the first part of the question. And then I guess for the two Canadians is, as I referenced at the beginning, and we've had several audience questions here on this point, so I wanted to find a way to work it in. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Global Affairs Canada has just announced an advisory committee on the Indo-Pacific. Are you confident that this advisory committee will be able to answer those questions? So Jim, it's up to you first.
Okay, the first point, Jonathan, commitment. We're either in this or we're not. Secondly, you've got to put real resources behind the commitment. And of course, the two are interlinked. You can't come in on one day and be gone the next. And when it comes to the GAC committee, I see a highly impressive array of committee members, although one of the things that distresses me is that when I look at their resumes, I see remarkably little evidence of any knowledge of or experience in the Indo-Pacific region. I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, very succinct, Jim. Okay, Tom, off to you.
Yeah, I think the main thing is that Canada needs to, we've used this sort of dance party kind of motif throughout. Canada needs to realize like the party's going on and everyone's, you know, really engaged in this, and you know, Canada needs to show up. In terms of, you know, interacting with, you know, with allies and partners, basically, you know, come to us, tell us what you know, what you can do, what you want to do. You know, let us know that you're willing and able, and then we'll realize, you know, we can have some serious discussions. Just in a nutshell.
Thanks very much, Tom. Fukushima-sensei.
Thank you. On your first question, visibility. Canada and Japan are working together in the Pacific on maritime security and other issues like CPTPP. We would like to see Canada's more visibility in the region, and that meets the need of Japan. Japan needs allies and partners to act together. And Japan and Canada have already committed to act together. So we would like to see it more visible. Second, I cannot wait to see Canadian policy on Indo-Pacific. I'm just waiting. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fukushima-sensei. We're all waiting. We hope it comes in. Thank you very much. John.
I think I would say strategic communications on what Canada is about in the region. And of course, the strategy will go a long way to helping that. I know it's turned a corner after Hong Kong and after the Uyghurs, but I think Jim's mentioning of values is such a core issue for Canada. And so it sort of feels like it's missing from the overall approach towards the region. So strategic communications on the strategy, and one would expect, one would hope to see that, you know, what Canada's values are in that strategy. Thank you.
Okay, Meredith, the last word for you. So what's Canada missing? I think what we're missing is potentially the attitude that countries of the region will welcome our priorities when and if we roll out our strategy. So I think there has been a lot of preaching of what Canada's priorities might be for this strategy. And I'm not sure that we're hearing the quiet suggestions and criticisms from the region for what they'd like to see in it. So just one example is this inclusivity word. This became evident to me at a recent meeting with some countries from the region where when they think about an inclusive Indo-Pacific strategy, they're talking about China. It's kind of quiet talk about, you know, who is in and who is out and where is China. That's not what the Canadian government is talking about when they talk about inclusivity. They're talking about economic inclusion of disadvantaged groups within society. And so we've got this kind of, you know, two groups not even talking to each other, not hearing each other, and not listening. When we're using exactly the same language, we mean completely different things by it. And so it's my hope that we can figure out a way to listen a little bit better and situate Canada's strategy in a way that makes sense to the region. What do we need to do that? I think that we need resources and commitments, which I've said before. And then on this advisory committee, it's my view that this advisory committee has largely been set to promote the strategy among Canadians and potentially in the business audience based on the composition of that group. So I'm not really sure that it's designed to answer the kinds of questions that you're asking, Jonathan.
Thanks so much, Meredith. What a great way to end. So much to chew on here. Clearly, we're going to have to need to gather you all around when this Indo-Pacific strategy eventually does come out. And we hope that we're at that point debating what's inside a robust Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy. But some of the key takeaways that I just had here from that last round is visibility, commitment, resources, purpose, and of course, I like the end that you said, Meredith, on empathy and listening. I think that there's a lot that we can offer in this part of the world, but absolutely it's a must that we need to listen to the region, hear what they want, hear the type of Canadian engagement that they need and want before we sort of prescribe that for them. So thank you so much for everyone from Honolulu to Sydney to Tokyo to Victoria to Ottawa and all of our listeners as well. It was a real pleasure. Great job, everybody. That was super.